Hey, good to see you. Thanks for coming. This is another episode of Wireframe, and today we're going to be talking about buoyant buttons. So, unfortunately, I started a little bit late today. I had a meeting that ran over, but we're here. It's still technically 5, even though it's maybe like 5:10 right now. So, a little bit late, but I hope that's okay. I did post today on LinkedIn that wireframe.fm has a new look. It actually matches the new, I guess, artwork that was introduced when we moved over to YouTube. So it's that kind of like crumpled white paper with the blue and the green, very interesting kind of font looking stuff. In fact, actually something that's bothering me is that the font that is being used for the images actually doesn't match the font on the website. So I will get those aligned eventually over time, but for right now, I don't think it matters too much. Additionally, I also set up the podcasts, or I guess I should say this show as a podcast. So now, as the shows are being introduced into YouTube after the live stream ends, Podbean, which is my platform now of choice, will be looking at the new videos that are uploaded into Design System House and creating podcasts from them. So now there's a full kind of pipeline of content coming out of Wireframe, which is really cool because we have the shows that you're seeing right now. We have the shorts that are posted on YouTube, Instagram, and now LinkedIn on the Design Systems House accounts. We do have the audio version of this stuff now, and of course the RSS feed for the audio stuff. So all of that stuff is ways that you can, get in touch with the Wireframe show and be involved with it and all that kind of good stuff. So got a nice pipeline going, making it nice and easy. Just a matter of me curating when I do the shorts and stuff. That gets a little, off the regular schedule for my workflow, but in terms of being able to create the content and hitting a button and being live, I think that's really great. All right, so in terms of our topic for today, which is buoyant buttons, you've probably never heard that before because it's a very unique concept. I'm going to be showing some visuals here, but if you want to kind of follow along about what I'm talking about later on, I have a blog I have a blog post that's called Close Thy Enemy that you can find on the blog. It's at blog.d'amato.design. And we're going to be kind of following through what this blog post is all talking about. But in the video, if you're watching, we're just going to look at the blog post over here and explain what I'm talking about. I'm bringing this up a little bit because there's been some conversations that I've had recently that kind of like talk about when to use different like CSS techniques, okay? I'm having a conversation recently about breakpoints, specifically media query breakpoints. And if you're unfamiliar with that, that's the idea of doing this kind of @ symbol, writing media, and then making some changes to CSS based on that media query. So one of those ones that we do all the time would be like prefers color contrast, right? Is it prefers reduced? I forget what it is because I barely use it now. I use something else entirely instead. But there's this prefers color scheme. That's the one. So there's media prefers color scheme. That's the one that gives you the light and dark modes. There's the prefers color contrast or prefers contrast, something like that for high contrast modes. You have the prefers reduced motion for reducing motion for animations and things like that. But the one that people probably use most often, which they probably might want to consider not using so often, is the ones that are checking for device width, right? So we see that very often. In fact, we have what we call breakpoints or device breakpoints at different kind of arbitrary numbers that have been, passed down from framework to framework to determine how big something is. I'm in this conversation with a group of people who are very kind of set in the ways of what we used to do back 10 years ago when we first heard of responsive design, which was to make a media query such that it would change the layout. Well, now in the year 2025, we don't need that kind of stuff because we have better ways of working with the web, and specifically in the term of container queries, right? So now our layout, which is being affected by how much size itself it contains, can be adjusted not because of some viewport that's way off in the distance of ancestry for this component, but instead the component itself can say, ooh, I'm too small to be in 2 columns right now as maybe a card. I can change because my width is very small and make changes inside of myself such that now things are stacked. And I can do that because of a container query that's determined by the size of itself, not the size of some arbitrary viewport that's happening. So changing your mindset for that kind of behavior is a little hard, especially if you've been doing it in media queries for 10 years and now container queries are suddenly here and you've never seen them before and you're like, why do I need this? I've always been doing it this way. And explaining why it's better, especially when you don't have their particular example in mind until they show it to you, it's really hard to do. I applaud people like Joss Como and Kevin Powell for doing all those different articles and videos trying to explain why it's good. But even then, you get people who just don't get it. And that's what this post is going to be talking a little bit more about. Not the media query stuff, but another thing that is using the right tool for the job without having bias toward history or other ways of people thinking about these kinds of things. And in fact, Kevin did a video on this subject that I introduced him to a year ago. And even in those comments, we had people that was explaining like, oh, why is, that you shouldn't be using this, it's too old, et cetera, et cetera. And I'm trying to explain to them, no, there's a real reason behind this. So I'm going to get into the blog post now. I'm going to show you what we're talking about. Again, this is the blog post called Close Thy Enemy. And the preface of the blog post is talking about the dismiss button that is typically in the top right-hand corner of things like modals and maybe some cards or panels or things like that. And initially, or I should say, I guess historically, we've positioned that button in the top right-hand corner using absolute position, right? So you put a position relative on the container, then on the button you would do a position absolute, and you could shove it in the top right-hand corner and, job is done. So I explained that in the post about one way of doing that, and I also outlined there's a whole bunch of design systems out there that you have probably heard of that do it exactly this way, right? So Carbon does it this way, GitHub Primer does it this way, Ant Design System, Chakra UI, Stacks from Stack Overflow, they all do it when I wrote the post at least, with this position absolute thing. Now, the problem with position absolute when you do that is it's very possible you're not taking into account the content going all the way to the right-hand side. So if you aren't paying attention to that, what may happen is that the content and that button may overlap with each other, making it either hard to read the content or worse, hard to click the button, right? So you need to account for when that content is hitting the button. And yes, you could be thinking you were in control of that content such that it'll never hit the button, but you might not be thinking about people translating that, which would again change the content of that text and potentially hitting the button. Now, another thing that some people might do, and I believe IBM Carbon does this, is that they add padding to the right-hand side of that content area such that that content never has an opportunity to hit that button. Now, that is an approach, but what happens with that is if the content area has a lot of content, then that becomes imbalanced because the left-hand side is a lot smaller in terms of its padding than the right-hand side. So you get that imbalance of content that I have the example for here. All right. So not the best solution, but again, it's the one that we've been doing. So you go, oh, this is, this is fine. It's okay, whatever. The next way of potentially handling this is by dedicating a header area to this component, right? This thing that you're going to be able to dismiss. So you would display flex that header, and then you could put the button on the right-hand side and then the content on the left. A couple of places that do that. Atlassian does this, Microsoft Fluent, Twilio Paste, Shopify, and Shoelace, they all do that kind of thing. The problem with this is if there's no header for some reason, then you have this kind of huge forehead that appears on top. Now, how often is it that we don't put a title inside of the header? Maybe not that often, but just in case someone decides that they're going to go wild and not put something there because they don't see it needed, then you're going to again have this weird layout where there's this huge kind of space, this gap above on top just for the close button, which, pushes things below the fold and potentially being, again, imbalanced. So might not be great for you there. Another problem with this is the complete opposite situation where you have too much in that header area. So you have several lines, and then, okay, well, if you have several lines, what happens with the X icon, right? The X icon just kind of sits in the middle, or maybe it goes to the top, and still provides a whole bunch of space underneath it in that event, right? So you're just not utilizing the space really nicely. Now, one of the alternatives or a couple of alternatives I've seen is Salesforce Lightning, or the original one at least, took that dismissal button and put it outside of the modal, right? So instead of worrying about it conflicting with the content, it just kind of placed it outside, which is an approach, certainly. And then for Spectrum, they actually avoid the X button entirely in many of these cases. So they would provide a explicit, dismissal, or maybe it's a click outside, but they completely avoid the close button entirely, according to my exploration. But in their alerts, they have the same problem that some of the other compositions do. And in fact, I have the screenshot of the icon that would be on the right-hand side kind of being affected by the content. So with all of these problems in the post, I introduce what I call the Buoyant approach. And the reason why I call it Buoyant is because it's using floats. So before we get into the actual approach and some examples on that, I'm going to go back to my face to kind of give you a little bit of background to this. As soon as I say float, or anyone says floats, there's going to be a group of people that are going to go, we can't use floats in layout anymore, right? That was back then. Now we have flex, and flex is better for layouts, right? That is the argument that I heard in Kevin's video. That's the argument I've seen in other things where people are talking about using floats at all. What those folks are missing is that CSS is a toolbox, and there's certain tools in that toolbox that are meant for certain reasons, right? The reason why you're using a float is not specifically for layout, right? That's what we used to do, over a decade ago or longer, right? We were using it because we didn't have the flex tool or the grid tool to use. So we only had things like table and floats to try to make the layouts that we wanted. But it doesn't discount the need for the behavior that float provides, which is to allow content to wrap around it. You can't get content to wrap around in Flexbox or Grid. You can't do it. You just can't. That's not what it's meant for. It's meant for laying out boxes of content. But if I wanted my text to wrap around an image, for example, you need to have float on the image such that the text can wrap around it. That's what float is for. So if I want content to wrap around a button, what do you use? You don't use flex, you use float. So that's what I'm trying to explain in the comments of the video earlier, and now in this particular video and in this blog post. I'm explaining the fact that I'm not using float strictly for trying to put boxes next to each other. It is for the purpose of us moving content around the button such that the content can still exist underneath the button, to the side of the button, but it never conflicts with the button. And that's the important point of the whole thing. So let's go back over to the blog post. So I have a couple of, criteria here, that the padding around the surface, which is like the modal here, needs to be visually consistent. The close button or dismissal thing should never move from that corner. And then the content in that surface, in that modal, should not collide with the close button. That's like a very important part of this whole thing. I do have a little note on here saying that, if this is like an image that's on the card, that's not actually like regular content, then that could appear as a position absolute on top of this thing, because it's not going to make any other sense to like make this thing float, because the image is going to take up too much room. We're really just talking about text content, so your header content, body content, and floating around that stuff. So in order for this to work, you kind of need to do a little bit of a setup, which is, it's not just a button that's making this work. There's a wrapper that needs to unfortunately happen, and that wrapper needs to know a little bit of information, unfortunately. Now, if your buttons are a regular size, that meaning that they don't increase or decrease in size, you can then have a little bit easier time doing this method. If the buttons do increase and decrease in size, you're going to have a little bit more work to do, because that wrapper that you're putting around this element is going to kind of need to know how big the button is, but that button will be a position absolute button, so it won't be in the flow to know, for that wrapper to know how big the button is, because it's broken out of the flow, if you know CSS. So what you're going to need is the surface itself is going to need to be a position relative, and then the button itself is going to need to be position absolute. So really no difference from the original kind of implementation of position absoluting that button. But the difference is that wrapper component that I mentioned that goes around the button. And that thing, you're going to add a float right, or I should more accurately say float inline end. So that's the logical property for right. At the time of me writing this blog post, the inline end didn't exist, so float right was what was going on. But your HTML kind of looks in this nature, where you have, again, the surface of the modal first, then you have the floater element that you're going to add the float to, and then finally your button internally, which is that position absolute thing. And again, you need to know how big the button is in order for the floater to be the right size. Because again, if it's position absolute, that child, the floater doesn't know how big the button is, and then wouldn't take up the right amount of space for that area. So they need to match. In the blog post, I have an example where you could actually update the text in there to show how it would affect it. I think actually if I open this up in CodePen, we could do a little resize on this thing too. So you could see how the blue area that's in there is just for demo purposes. You can actually remove that if you just remove the demo thing. And that should just pop itself out. There it goes. So so you could see how, the space that the floater takes up is what that blue button is trying, or the blue background is trying to show. And we could see that as I, increase and decrease the width of this modal looking thing, the text will never conflict with that button, but when it's available, the text can definitely go underneath it, right? And it definitely also depends on the kind of word that's underneath the button, right? Because if the word is too long, and it has to wrap to the next line, then you're going to have some space underneath like this. But that all depends on that actual content. But at least in this composition, it has the opportunity to go underneath, if it makes sense, right? So in lots of different cases here, we could see that there's plenty of opportunity for that to go underneath and have the ability to look nice in some of its configurations. It won't look like this kind of lockup all of the time, right? If the size of the thing looks smaller, you might get this really large gap underneath. And again, there's really no way of truly curating the content that's going to appear in this header, but at least in this composition, we have the opportunity for it to wrap around, okay? And that's really what we're talking about down here in terms of a buoyant approach, right? It's this idea that, again, Flex isn't going to solve your problem here. To be able to get content to wrap around an element, float is really the only way of doing it. Unless you're going to do some wild JavaScript-y calculation thing that tries to move some stuff around. Like, you don't want that. Float already does it. It's been doing it for, what, like 20 years at this point. And just because we kind of wrote off floats as layout back, years ago, doesn't mean that they don't have their place where they need to be, okay? Now, I was explaining a little bit about me getting heated about media queries as well. And that's like the opposite problem, where it's almost like the same way of us saying we need to continue to use floats, even if we have Flexbox, right? For regular layout, right? That's like this I don't know, almost like steadfast way of thinking, this stuck in their ways kind of thinking of saying, no, floats are always, they've always worked for me, and that's all we're going to use, right, for layout. And that's not the case, right? There's a reason why you're going to pick a particular tool out of your toolbox, right? What we used to do is we used to handsaw everything. And now we have circular saws and table saws and things that are going to make things a lot easier for us, and in some cases maybe, you know, a lot more efficient, you know. And we want to potentially move to the new things when it's appropriate. But in some cases, it's not appropriate to use, you know, the new thing for, I don't know. I'm trying to think of a tool analogy, but I can't think of one. But there's certain reasons why you would pick a particular tool instead of another one. And it shouldn't be because someone else told you. You should have a understanding of the tools and when they're meant to be used and what the setbacks are and what the benefits are. You should know that. You shouldn't just pick up something because someone else told you to do it, okay? And in this example, I'm explaining why floats are meant to be used here, right? Floats aren't meant to be used for general layout. We have Flexbox for that, but there's a benefit to using floats in this particular case. So that's what I wanted to talk about today. If you have any questions about, you know, this approach in particular, you can leave them in the comments down below in the YouTube channel. I don't know, I guess the audio stuff won't have comments necessarily, but come on over to the YouTube channel. You can watch it over there if you like. In terms of the other things that I would normally talk about, which would be jobs and events, I do believe that there were some jobs that were posted on the Design System Slack channel. Speaking of slacking, I've been slacking off on the Discord channel that I normally have, but it looks like Persona is hiring a design system designer. Looks like PandaDoc is also hiring a product designer for design systems. Skylight is also trying to hire a senior product designer. Culture Amp is looking for a apparently special technical design role. That could be interesting. And I think we'll just pause. Oh no, and there's also a senior UX designer at Twitch that was also opened earlier this month in June. So I think that covers some of the jobs that I probably didn't catch up on the last couple of wireframes. When it comes to events, I'm pretty sure actually that there isn't anything hanging out on DS events. I've been slacking off on that one too. Yeah, there isn't anything that's coming up on there, but where's my phone's over there. Okay, let's look at my calendar because I saw Andy Stewart, shout out to Andy Stewart at Vercel Ship, and I was telling him there was an event. I'm like, hey, you going to the event? He's like, what event? I'm like, I gotta share my calendar with you, but let's see here. So yeah, I don't have anything this week in terms of events here in New York City, or even online. I don't even see anything other than that. I don't think there's I didn't see an email for the question either this week, so it must be off for July 4th. That's probably what's happening. Next week, though, I do know that there's a How Figma UX Writers Use Figma on Wednesday, so I will remind people about that thing as it comes up. But that's the only thing. Yeah, so kind of a light week or a couple of weeks when it comes to events. If I do hear of anything, I will definitely report it over here. If you know of anything, let me know about it so I could share it. Or, of course, if it's design system related, you can put it at ds.events yourself. I would very much appreciate that. I'm going to try to see if I can go back in time and put in some older events just for record keeping purposes. But that's it for today. I appreciate you watching. Thanks for joining me here. Play nice in the comments, and I'll see you next time. Bye.